Good evening all and welcome to tonight's collection of camping stories, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Late one summer/early fall, my husband and I went camping at the beach with his daughter and her fiancé. We had a fun, chill time snacking and watching the sunset, then got in our tents to sleep after dark. I had this awful uneasy feeling that I just couldn't shake, but I didn't want to be a party pooper. Finally, I said something to my husband, who felt the same way but also didn't want to ruin the trip. After a moment of discussing what to do, he decided to tell the kids that we weren't really digging it and wanted to go home. In an instant, he was back at our tent. The kids felt the same way, and we started packing up immediately as fast as we could. Few words exchanged, but all laser focused on the same task: getting out of there. My stepdaughter and I waited in the car while the guys packed in the last of the gear. As they approached us, a huge, lifted white truck came out of the darkness and plowed through the area we were just settled in not 10 minutes ago. It would have absolutely crushed us. It was a freaky experience for all of us that could have ended so much worse, especially since she had just gotten pregnant with her first baby at the time. We're so thankful to all still be here together. We haven't gone beach camping ever since. I don't know what force compelled us to leave that night, but it's worth mentioning that my father's ashes were spread at this beach years prior, as it was his favorite place. I went to Guatemala with my girlfriend, and we embarked on a 3-day hike through the jungle to reach Tikal. We slept in a tent at 2 tiny ranger campsites deep in the woods. On the second night, a massive thunderstorm loomed above us. At 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of male voices outside our tent. Curious and concerned, I stepped out to investigate and found 2 men with rifles approaching us. I told my girlfriend to stay in the tent because it seemed dangerous. However, she didn't listen and joined me outside. As it turned out, the men were local hunters seeking shelter at the camp. We offered them coffee, which they gladly accepted, and about 30 seconds later the storm intensified and a massive tree crashed onto our tent. If I hadn't gone out to check on the voices or if my girlfriend had stayed in the tent, we both could have been crushed to death. This was by far the scariest thing that ever happened to me while camping. My partner and I are avid hikers. Last July, we went on a trip and decided to camp at this spot we love, just west of Shenandoah. It's quiet off the beaten path and offers absolutely spectacular views of both Shenandoah and portions of George Washington National Forest to the west. The first day and evening of the trip itself were nice and uneventful, though we didn't sleep super well because of the humidity. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike in a portion of the Jefferson Forest we'd never been to before. It's comprised of ATV trails and about a dozen campsites, but has a trail that leads to an old fire tower we'd always wanted to check out. It was about a 45-minute drive from our campsite, mostly on back roads. When we got there, the first thing that stuck out to us was how empty the campsites were. We actually didn't camp there the night before because we heard that the site is usually packed, and we knew we wouldn't arrive early enough in the weekend to get a spot. There were only 2 spots taken. In one was a desiccated tent and a bunch of garbage. It looked like someone had been there for a while, but it was deserted when we arrived. In the other, there was a young woman, I'm guessing in her late teens, setting up a small backpacking tent. There was a truck and one of the smaller car parked in the area. We parked and started getting our gear together, and the woman approached us to ask if we knew where the trailhead was. I told her that we'd read that it branched off about 100 yards into one of the ATV tracks, but we weren't 100% sure which. Since I was getting such weird vibes from the place, I kind of hoped she'd stick around and go with us to find it, but she thanked us and took off in the general direction of the trail. We set off and walked up and down a few of the ATV trails until we found the walking path. We saw 2 ATVs shoot by us at one point, but otherwise didn't encounter anyone else, including the woman from earlier. It took us about an hour to get to the top of the mountain where the fire tower was. It's an old metal structure, and you have to climb down a narrow set of stairs to get to the top of it. We got up, looked around, took some pictures, and started heading down. Honestly, the view was kind of a letdown. About halfway down, very suddenly, everything stopped. The birds, the bugs, it was dead silent. And I don't know quite how to put it into words, but it felt like the ancientness of the forest was contorting and crushing us. I felt trapped and cornered in spite of the expanse around us. My partner and I looked at each other and wordlessly started to book it out of there. We started running back to the car, but the feeling only followed us. As we were rounding one of the switchbacks, we heard this unearthly shriek, like a cross between Metal on Metal and a choir screaming off-key. And we saw something. I just got a glimpse of it before we blacked out. I don't know how to describe it, other than it looked huge despite clearly not taking up much physical space and moved in wraiths and flashes. It didn't have color. It just felt like an evil emptiness. I probably only perceived it for half a second before my memory just completely gave way. When we came to, we were sitting in the car, and 2 hours had passed, double the length of time it took us to get up there. I don't know if we lost consciousness or just somehow blocked those hours out. I learned later the exact same thing happened to my partner. Both of the cars were next to us in the parking lot, and there was still just the 2 tents at the campsite. The woman wasn't in hers, and it looked exactly the same as she'd left it. I think about her all the time, and have spent an extended amount of time trying to figure out if someone went missing around the time of our trip. It took a few months for my partner and I to talk about that day. Some of the stories I've heard here before have made me feel much less alone. We still love to hike, but honestly, we haven't been able to go to the Appalachian forest since this happened. And I'm curious if anyone else has had any experiences like this. I went camping with my girlfriend about 4-ish years ago in the mountains just east of where we live. We're both a little hippie, so we brought some toys, juggling bags, Diablo, poi, etc., and thought it might be fun to bring out our recently acquired brass singing bowls. We have 3 different sizes that produce different tones, with middle-sized green bowls being our favorite in both tones and appearance. If you've ever played a singing bowl before, you know they don't just make the tones by themselves, and it can take a little effort to get the tone out cleanly and clearly. In my opinion, that's kind of the fun of the bowls, coaxing the sound out of it. It adds a little bit of necessary skill and makes the singing bowls an instrument with a little exclusivity. The second night out there, after bedding down for the night, I wake up suddenly to hear the green bowl unmistakably singing. My girlfriend was in the tent with me, so it definitely wasn't her. Again, they don't sing by themselves, and they have to be played, so of course both of us were rightly surprised, perplexed, and admittedly freaked out by the fact that this bowl was singing seemingly of its own accord. She nudged me to see if I was experiencing the same thing she was, looked at me wide-eyed and said, "Are you hearing this too?" I nodded for fear that my speech would cause the bowl to stop, and after staring at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was realistically more 3 minutes, we quietly resolved to make our way over to the zipper flap of the tent and open it, just enough to see what was playing our bowl. However, as soon as we started to move, the bowl stopped, and not just like someone stopped playing and walked away, no. It stopped. The bowl muted. No resonating tone whatsoever. It was like someone had grabbed the edge of the bowl like you would a cymbal on a drum kit and muted it instantly. After the silencing, we rushed ourselves out of the tent in the hopes that maybe we could catch a slight glimpse or sound of whatever or whoever it was that had decided to stop by and play with our instruments. But alas, nothing was there. No footprints, no trail, no indication that anything at all had been anywhere near the bowl. We still cannot explain what happened that night, and it's one of those stories that even sends a bit of a shiver down my spine and makes the hair stand on end. Whatever played our bowls that night didn't feel hostile or angry, perhaps curious or playful, but it definitely didn't want us to know what it was. I grew up camping and doing backpacking trips with my family all over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Being very comfortable and experienced in the hills, I started doing wilderness solo hikes, and I was in my early 20s. Some of them would last for weeks and would involve things like my dad dropping me off at a trailhead outside of Yosemite and picking me up somewhere like Smith Valley, Nevada 3 weeks later. I always had a GPS locator with a way to contact my family, and my routes were very well planned. I always take a pistol with me, and the first 2 rounds are always snake shot because rattlesnakes are very common in the area. So I'm doing a hike across the Ansel Adams wilderness with no tent, just a sleeping bag under the stars. 3 days into the trip, I'm sitting by a small lake as the sun is going down and I'm getting ready to settle in for the night. But just as I make the decision to stand, I look up and there's a huge mountain lion standing about 20 feet from me. The next few moments can only be described as being awkward. I calmly sat back on my rock and unholstered my pistol but made no sudden moves. I didn't want to shoot the animal, and I doubt 2 rounds of snake shot followed by a few 38s would really do a lot. If it came to that, hopefully it would just at least give it an attitude adjustment or the sound scare it away. So here I am about 40 miles from any sign of civilization, and I start talking to the lion. It was all I could really think to do, so I started telling it about that day's hike and some of the things I'd seen. I talked about the weather and asked if it knew any good places to grab a bite, preferably something not bipedal. The conversation went on for maybe a minute as the lion paced very slowly, never breaking eye contact. Then, after what felt like eons, it just casually turned and walked away. I sat there talking for a good 20 minutes before the adrenaline started to wear off, and suddenly I was exhausted. Sleeping was difficult, especially trying to hold a knife in one hand and a pistol on the other, but once my eyes closed, it seemed like an instant until the sun was back up. As I got closer to the end of the trip, an unexpected and unusual high heat wave came in. The temperature was over 105 degrees at 10,000 feet elevation. Water sources seemed to dry up overnight, and I knew where some natural springs were located, but they were off my route or around 20 miles away. Without exerting more energy than I needed to, I still arrived at my rendezvous point a full day early. A tire blew out and led to my dad being almost a day late, and the water source at the pickup spot was now bone dry. So I had about 60 to 72 hours in 100+ weather at elevation without water. I was able to get a tiny bit of water from a solar sill I made and wrapping a bag around some plants, just enough to stay alive. By the time my dad got to me, I was having full-on hallucinations and was in pretty bad shape. Luckily, he showed up with a case of Gatorade, vitamin water, and a cooler filled with ice packs and protein bars. I got checked out by a doctor in Carson City just to be safe. The forecast had nothing about the heat wave, and water was abundant still after it hit, so there was nothing I could have done to better prepare myself for that situation. Definitely a terrifying trip, and after many more adventures, my wife refused to let me do long wilderness trips alone. I was driving cross-country with my dog and planned to camp over in Yellowstone. However, when I arrived, every campground in the park was completely full. I drove the loop a few times and kept asking, but the sun was going down and there was still no vacancy anywhere. I found an out-of-the-way trailhead parking lot, hitched up my frame pack, and hiked up the trail for a little bit, then off a few yards to the edge of a pasture. Cleared a site, dug a small fire pit in the dirt, and pitched my four-man. I ate a few hot dogs with my dog, hung all the leftovers and trash in a nearby tree, buried the fire ashes and climbed into my sleeping bag. So far, not sure it gets better. That's when I woke up to the sound of wolves howling in the distance. Hard to say how far, but a few miles. I thought it was beautiful. I just started to drift asleep again, when the howling was now at the opposite edge of the pasture I was on. Still maybe 3/4 of a mile. They moved quickly, but I wasn't worried. Next time they howled, they were in the middle of the pasture and eventually circling my tent. It's hard to say how many when it's a four-legged animal, but howls and footfalls together, I'd say at least 4 to 5. Both my dog and I lay silently, hoping they were just curious, and after a very tense few minutes, they did begin to break away and finally moved on. After I heard a howling from 3/4 of a mile in the other direction, we both relaxed and fell asleep. The sky was still dark. The next time I woke up, the sky was still dark, but I felt like I had slept a few more hours. This time, however, whatever was circling my tent was much larger. The footfalls were audibly large, and the breathing could be heard. Although I never saw it, my guess was a bear. He seemed most interested in where I buried the fire. Perhaps some juices from the hot dogs did not fully burn off, but once done nosing around, turned his attention to my tent and circled it a few times. Unlike the wolves, I was slightly more concerned that a large bear would breach the tent if hungry, so I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. From the outside, imagine the sudden appearance of a large glowing green dome. I startled the bear that immediately froze in place. It seemed to be enough to make it reevaluate whatever it was thinking, and it soon began moving away. But I couldn't sleep another wink. But the sky was now starting to brighten, and after an hour of listening carefully, I stuck my head out of my tent and looked around. It was all clear. Light rain started to fall, so what would have been a hasty pack-out was even hastier. I collected everything and headed back to the truck. I managed to find a campground with a vacancy that morning. Insult to injury. And after hanging my damp tent up to dry on site, a ranger came by and asked where I stayed the previous night, as they have a record of me entering the park but not checking into a camp. I lied and said I slept in my truck in a parking lot and got a ticket. The rest of my time in the park was fantastic, and ended up in Portland, Oregon for another week of camping my way across without further incident. I was in rural Virginia while I was living in my car back in 2017. I pulled off into a pretty large camping area that was empty, except for a large group of people across the way. They were pretty rowdy but kept to themselves for the most part. Besides, their dogs coming over and checking us out. Fast forward a few hours after the sun had set and I was in my hammock about to go to sleep. Across the way I heard, "Y'all wanna light the cross?" I look up and see a woman and a young child walk over to a large wooden cross that they had put up outside their camping area. With careful direction, the woman coaxed the young child to reach over and light the cross on fire. Then it got weird. It was a whole KKK group going through one of their ceremonies. There were lots of very inflamed speeches, lots of white power shouts emanating from the crowd, and these seemingly unending tirades about how the white race needs to purify the country from the unclean. It wasn't so much a message they were shouting, but that image of the innocent little child gently being coaxed by a loved one into an ideology of hate is one that still haunts me to this very day. 2 summers ago, my girlfriend and I set off on an 8-mile backpacking trip into a remote section of the wilderness around Mount Hood, Oregon. We experienced 2 utterly terrifying incidents, one involving a person and the other one involving the weather. We established our camp by a lake surrounded by a forest of dead trees, which were dry and brittle. Across the lake, there was only one other tent, but we never saw anyone at that site, which is a detail that will become important later. Within an hour, an unexpected thunderstorm began forming in the distant hills. We had checked the weather forecast, and thunderstorms are uncommon in the Pacific Northwest. We secured our tent as best we could, dug a small trench in anticipation of the heavy rain, and tried to position ourselves in a safer area from the dead trees, which was difficult. The wind began to howl, the rain began to pour in sheets, and lightning was striking everywhere in the distance. We climbed into our tent and hunkered down, filled with anxiety. Throughout this entire time, we never saw anyone at the other campsite preparing for the storm, which was very odd. As the storm intensified and night fell, we heard dead trees snapping all around us, with lightning illuminating everything, like daylight and rain hammering our tents. We were terrified, fearing that the dead trees might fall or blow onto us. There was nowhere safe to go without hiking several miles. Eventually, we fell asleep as the storm began to abate. Then came the second frightening incident. We woke up to a flash beam shining on our tent, moving very close. It was one of those moments that makes your stomach drop. I yelled out to whoever was there, and the light immediately turned off, never to be seen again. The rest of the night was sleepless and dreadful, and the next morning we still saw no one at the other campsite. It looked deserted, but clearly someone had been snooping around our tent the previous night. To this day, the memory still unsettles me. Another time, my 2 friends and I were car camping at Clatsop State Forest, where there are numerous 4x4 trails to explore. We heard a lot of noise about half a mile away, included yelling and gunshots, ATVs and dirt bikes going late into the night. While we cooked dinner, we heard a slow screeching sound of metal grinding on metal coming towards us around the bend. A truck's headlights shone on us as it pulled uncomfortably close to our camp, and 2 drunken redneck guys stumbled out, literally tripping every few steps. They asked for help changing their tire, and we agreed just to get them away from us. When we walked to the back of their truck, we discovered the entire wheel was missing, and they were driving on the axle. They quickly forgot about the missing wheel and said that they were heading down to a party and invited us to join them in the truck bed. We declined, and they drove off on the axle along the cliff edges and steep inclines. The rest of the night, ATVs drove by our camp, shining lights on our tents with numerous gunshots in the distance. I was tent camping in Arkansas around the year 2003, and the Blair Witch Project was still fresh in my mind. I was about 20 at the time. Around 2 to 3 a.m., we were woken up by what sounded like a small child running around our tent crying and trying to get in. I was thoroughly freaked out. Finally, I decided to open the tent, and there was a kid that couldn't have been more than 3 years old, scared half to death and only wearing a diaper. I had lots of thoughts going through my head, but mostly, how the hell do I handle this? I can't really go from campsite to campsite. The ranger office is closed, and I'm standing there in the middle of the night holding a child that isn't mine. We had decided to call the cops, figuring it was the safest thing to do. Just then a lady walks down the trail and is like, "How did you get out?" The kid was saying, "Mama, Mama," and went straight to her. She nonchalantly said thank you and walked away. Now, as a parent, I can't imagine how much more that would freak me out if it were my kid. A few years ago, my wife and I went camping together. We were sitting around the campfire having pleasant conversation when suddenly it started to pour with rain. We retreated back to the inside of the tent, and the rain was so heavy that we couldn't hear anything over the pitter-patter hitting the tent. We decided to change our clothes and call it a night. Not much else was going to be achieved with this rain, so we get into our sleeping bags and turn out the light when we hear a sound. It's sort of like a bleat-bleat sound. It's the one I would describe a Motorola phone would make when the battery was dying. The only thing was, we didn't have any phones that would make that sound, and ours were switched off. We were miles from anyone. The rain was pouring, and we couldn't hear if someone was walking up to our tent, let alone if someone walked away from it. We were trapped inside this canvas death trap with only one exit. We froze and waited for what seemed like hours. Eventually I grabbed my gun and light and made a dash for the door, trying to get out as fast as I could. Once out, I ran around my tent. There was nothing, no one, not a sign of life anywhere. We grabbed our valuables and decided to make the 10-minute trek to our car. We made it safe, drove an hour home and slept better than we would have if we stayed. The next day, we drove back to get our stuff, and when we got to our tent, it didn't look like anything had been messed with. Nothing was out of place. We packed everything up, and when we were getting home and unloading everything from the vehicle, my wife couldn't find her underwear. Not one of them. Nothing else was missing from our stuff, and it was the wildest and creepiest experience we'd had. Who the hell was out there in the pouring rain in the middle of nowhere, just waiting to steal my wife's underwear? And what would have happened had we not left when we did? Would he have perhaps been more inclined to do something a bit more abrupt and dire? Last year in late summer, 2 friends and myself went camping in British Columbia in a pretty populated campsite. It was supposed to be a super chill evening. We had cooked some food and were sharing a bottle of wine and stayed up late chatting. The time was about 1 a.m. We were probably the only people awake at the site as everything was silent around us, when all of a sudden we hear this thumping, running sound towards us, and this feeling of dread sink into our bones. I have never been more afraid in my life. What was funny was at first we thought it was a man, but it must have been huge as the ground itself shook. It was pitch black, and we had lights on around us so we couldn't see much beyond our area. Whatever it was charged last at full speed, and then we heard a huge crash into the river beside our site. We ran and hid in the car and assumed it was a bear. Even now when we talk about it, we're still not completely sure, as nothing could begin to describe the feeling of terror we each felt just before we heard the footsteps. And to this day, it remains the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I was camping with some friends on one of their family's land that bordered a national forest. Our tents were just inside the clearing part of the property, facing the house and barn, and other outbuildings. Behind us was an uncleared land that after a distance met the boundary of the national forest. I was sharing a tent with my then boyfriend and a friend of his. I was at the back of the tent next to a mesh window. We had the flaps all open for airflow through the mesh windows because it was warm. I woke up feeling like someone was moving around the campsite. I couldn't hear anyone up and about, but saw movement back in the uncleared land behind the campsite. A completely dark human-shaped figure was leaning out from behind a tree, then slowly moving back behind it. It did this a few times, and I woke up my boyfriend to see if he could also see it, but he said he couldn't, but did see something run deeper off into the forest. He switched places with me, and we went back to sleep. His friend never woke up. He says that what he saw was definitely upright, not a deer or anything like that. We are about 2 miles from a public hiking trail and 4 miles from a public campground. There were other houses on the same road bordering the forest, but located pretty far apart. I'm still unsure who or what that was, but it was creepy. No one should have been out there. It was definitely on my friend's family land. And what the hell did they want with us anyway? I used to work as a guide, and then as a backup, and even as a field director for several wilderness therapy programs for troubled kids in Arizona, Utah, and Idaho. They were all good jobs, but where I worked in Utah was in the West Desert south of Dugway. It's possibly the ugliest and creepiest part of Utah. Tons of sketchy stuff happened to us out there, and this story is circa 2005. The group were camped in a really nice area for that part of the desert called Indian Canyon. This spot was so nice, in fact, that in the late 1800s or early 1900s, some enterprising pioneer family had built themselves a little homestead with a 1-room cabin and small barn and a cedar pole fence around the perimeter of the little farm. All that remained of that, of course, was now a crumbling, rotten ruin. The cabin itself seemed to have been burnt down well over 50 years ago, and what remained of the barn was poking out of the grass in 2 or 3 foot shards of grey wood scattered all over the near vicinity. This week I was camped in Indian Canyon, but further down the road. I was maintaining the Infield Emergency Response Vehicle, or the EVR, known as Backup, a new position I helped invent when I took a list of things that had gone wrong in the field to the directors and explained that because of the horrible response time and spotty satellite phone service, the only reason we weren't shut down or that people weren't dead was sheer luck. Not because we were prepared or efficient at responding to emergencies. Now we had radios and someone listening to them 24/7, never more than a few minutes away with a vehicle. That's how it worked in theory anyway. One of the boys' groups was camped at the mouth of the canyon in the foothills about 2 miles away from me. The other just a mile beyond them. The girls were close too. I was camped somewhere in the middle of the canyon on top of a small ridge that had a little jeep track side road branching off the main dirt road running up the canyon, and the girls were just a few ridges over, maybe a mile away. Though to drive to them, I'd have to go back out of the main road and take a different jeep trail up to their spot, perhaps a 5-mile trip. It was about 1.5 miles below the staff training group that was being headed up by my ex-wife, Jessica. There were going to be several groups of parents coming out to visit their kids later in the week, so both the boys' groups and the girls' group, all on that side of the mountain, had elected to stay put for a few days and work on building backpacks and gathering fire sets, and a lot of other primitive skills. The training group had been in the field for almost a week, and they were getting ready to split up and go join the student groups for the last several days of their training. This left me with less to do than normal. I didn't have to find new sites for the groups or drop anyone's water or food. Everyone was well taken care of, and no one was moving for several days. I decided to build a sweat lodge next to the creek up near where the new staff were camped. I found the perfect spot well out of sight of the group on a little smooth sandbar right by the water and got to work. I harvested some long willow saplings that were bendable enough to weave a frame with and arranged them in a 10-foot circle, digging down 1.5 feet for each one to anchor it into the sand. I bent them into a dome 4 foot high and 10 foot across, and wove the branches together with supporting crossbars until I had a structure that I could probably have stood on without breaking it. I walked down to the truck, which I had hidden in some pine trees a quarter of a mile away, and hauled a large bin of tarps and cowhides and plastic sheeting, along with my fire set and some other gear up to my lodge. As I was walking back to the creek, I remember feeling like someone was following me, but when I stopped and turned around, I could neither see nor hear anyone. It was just a beautiful day for July. The morning had started out with some high, wispy cloud cover that had long since burned off, and the noon sun was high overhead. It wasn't yet too hot. I was high enough in the mountains that the oppressive heat that I knew of was slowly baking the kids' groups in the desert below, but wouldn't reach me for another few hours. I set to work placing hides first on my little domed frame. I covered those with some tarps and plastic sheeting, and secured it all so that I had as close to an airtight and waterproof shelter as possible, with only a small arched opening for a door. I secured an old military poncho over the door so that once hot rocks had been placed inside, it could be sealed shut and the sweat ceremony could take place. I wanted it as hot as possible. There wouldn't be any children involved in this one, so we could go as hot as we liked. I took the extra time around the base of the lodge to bury all the edges of the coverings deep in the sand. This was as sturdy a shelter structure as I had ever built. It was nice. I spent a good hour gathering sage and juniper and covered the floor of the lodge with the thick padding of the fragrant plants. I did this in part so that it was a soft place to sit for an extended time, but mostly I did it because I was intending to invite the new staff down to do a sweat ceremony later to help some of them prepare to meet actual students for the first time. And frankly, a group of unwashed men and women who hadn't showered in a week in July, all crammed inside a sweltering home-made domed tent sweating buckets, is a smell that should not be endured without as much sage and juniper as possible. If it was really bad, which it was likely to be, I would rub some of it into my shirt and then pull it up over my nose and breathe through that. I went hunting for lava rock. I found an outcropping of small rounded boulders, perfect for heating on a bonfire and then rolling into the lodge, and I proceeded to gather 3 onto a tarp. It was heavy, almost too much for me to sling over my back and carry, but I managed to make it to the fire pit I had dug with all 3. I left them there and went to gather more. I made this smaller load because it's not like I was in a hurry. I could take more trips. When I got back to the fire pit, one of my rocks was gone. I stared at a small depression in the sand where I had placed it minutes before, and then looked around for signs of someone, possibly one of the staff from the group, had come and taken it. There were no tracks. I looked around again and spotted it by the edge of the creek 20 feet away, and again had that feeling like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone in the trees. I walked over and retrieved my stone, the heaviest one I had carried, and put it back with the others. Maybe it had rolled there through the flat, dry sand. I gathered a bunch more rocks and none of them went missing, and then I built a fire. As I worked, that weird feeling of being watched resumed, only this time it felt more ominous, like it was mad at me for being there. I stood up, determined to walk out of the woods and find whoever it was. The radio, which I kept on and strapped to my belt, had been silent all day, but it suddenly crackled to life. Brian in the boys' group was doing evening checking a little early, so that they could do their all-day hike without having to stop and contact me. After we spoke, I felt more normal again. I cooked some rice and beans for dinner, and as they cooled off, I piled my stones, probably 30 of them, into a cairn in the center of the fire. I just piled all of the dry wood and brush I could gather. I took up my knife and my sheath, because that feeling was back, but worse. As soon as my fire became almost irresponsibly big, I saw someone move fast through the trees straight towards me. I tensed, then relaxed. Will, a seasoned staff member working the training group with Jessica and Katie, came running down the creek. He stopped when he saw me and my sweat lodge and my 10-foot-tall flame and broke into a huge grin. He told me he thought it was a wildfire and that some of the new girls were panicking. Nope, just an epic sweat lodge, I tell him. I was planning on inviting you all down for it when you called in, but I'll consider this your check-in if you guys want to. You're all invited to come and sweat. It'll be ready in about a half hour. Perfect, he said. They're just finishing dinner. I'll go let Katie and Jess know and we'll be down. He turned to walk away. Hey, Will? Did you guys lose track of any of the new guys today? Or did one of you three come down this way? He thought for a moment and said, No, I don't think so. Why? It's nothing. Just thought someone might have come looking for me when I was gathering rocks. Some of my stuff was in a different place that I remember leaving it, that's all. He looked at me with an odd expression. Weird. I'll ask everyone, but we've kept pretty busy today, so we would have known if someone had come down this far. That's okay. Don't stress, just wondering. See you in a bit. After Will walked off, the other two kids' groups radioed me. It was more like an hour before the staff group finally trudged into my little sandy clearing. Some of them looked excited, and some of them looked confused with my dome of plastic and sand and at my pile of glowing red boulders on the still blazing fire, and at the sack of a blue 5-gallon water jugs I had hauled down from the truck for the experience. We thought we were going to die in a forest fire, one of the new girls, Carol Sue, said accusingly. She looked extra smelly, and I pulled some essential oils out of my possibilities bag. Put some of this on your wrists and neck. It'll help you keep a good frame of mind in the sweat. How many of you have done this before? A handful of them raised their hand. Inside the circle of the lodge is a sacred place. We will be doing 4 sessions, going longer each time. We will dedicate each session to a different part of our lives, histories, families, struggles, and choices. Try to only speak from the heart about these things. It'll be very hot once we begin pouring water on the rocks, and the heat will make it very difficult to speak anyway, so only speak if it's important. Katie and Will were already rolling the superheated rocks into the lodge, using some of the long willow poles I had made. I took out a dried sage smudge and lit it on the fire and did the ritual smoke cleansing for each of them as they entered the hallowed ground. I made the last-minute decision to not go in the sweat lodge. The last boys group had a student that was a little bit of trouble, and I was worried that I would have to end up taking an emergency radio call about a runner in the middle of someone's heartfelt speaking about their issues with their family or their past. Also, the smell. Something just felt off. This was a perfect spot and a perfect time for a sweat lodge ceremony. But it felt, well, not wrong exactly, but off somehow. Instead, I whispered my choice to Katie, as she was the last one to enter, and sealed the door up behind them, burying the edge of the poncho in the sand like the rest of the construction. I stood by the fire for a minute or two and felt hot. So I walked in the water down the narrow stream about 100 yards and just looked at the stars that were slowly becoming more visible in the darkening twilight. I stood there for at least 10 minutes enjoying the changing sky. That's when I heard a twig snap somewhere to my left, and the crickets went silent. There was definitely somebody up there, in the trees. I stared hard and could not at first see anyone, but there was a small dark shadow under a pine, 30 or 40 feet away. Too dark for this early in the evening? Was that a girl in the shadow? It looked like a small Native American girl with long braids and some kind of headband. I called out to her, but she didn't move. She seemed to be glaring at me, and the longer I stood there, the worse I felt, like the warmth from the air around me was being sucked away. So I took a deep breath and did what I always do in the woods when something unknown scares me. I ran at it. Whoever was there took off fast, and I chased them. I lost them quickly enough. I am not a runner by any means, but I was sure they were heading in the direction away from my little creekside sweat lodge. I must have got an eighth of a mile, almost to the road, when I heard all the staff at the sweat lodge scream behind me. My blood ran cold, and I turned on my heel and sprinted back up the canyon. I almost missed the sweat lodge clearing when I came to it, because nothing I saw made sense. The fire was out, not even a glow. The sweat lodge was gone. The tarps had all been pulled and ripped off, and the hides were flung out in a wide circle on the ground in the bushes and the water. The frame was uprooted and folded over on its side to just one side of the sandbar, and all the new and experienced staff were sitting stunned in a circle on a padding of sage and juniper around a pile of cold rocks. "What happened?" I yelled as I ran up. After a moment, Katie answered. "We were just sitting here starting to pour water on the rocks and heat things up. And we started talking a little about what it means to, your personal history and stuff. And the walls of the sweat lodge started to shake. We thought you were outside trying to get in. It stopped for a minute and Jess called you by name, but you didn't answer. And we had just poured on some more water on the rocks when the whole lodge went cold. It sounded like a massive windstorm blew in and ripped the whole thing off us, frame and all, threw it into the trees." I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my bag and got out every flashlight I had. We started to check each other for injuries. I lied through my teeth and told them it was a microburst windstorm, and that they happened sometimes in Utah, and they were lucky no one got hurt and so on. And amidst skeptical looks from the three who knew me, I got Jessica and Will to start taking the stunned newbies back to camp. But Katie stayed. Katie, who had been with me through so many other unexplainable things out there, knew what I was doing. She could tell I wasn't seeing something. The fire's out like it's cold, and it was 1,000 degrees 20 minutes ago with the rocks glowing hot. And I feel like you've just been sitting in the creek. What are you not saying, Dan? I took a deep breath. I just tried to chase down a little Native American girl who can run unnaturally fast in the dark. Katie sat down hard. I looked at her, but she didn't say anything. Today, while I was gathering up rocks for the lodge, I felt like someone was watching me the whole time. And I swear I'm not making this up. But I set down that really big rock, the first one you rolled into the circle, and walked away for a few minutes, and when I returned, it was over by the creek, like someone had moved it, but there were no tracks, and it couldn't have been rolled there. Then after you went to the sweat lodge, I walked down the creek and heard something in the trees. It took me a minute to spot her, but she was hiding in the shadow of a tree. I chased her for 30 seconds, and when you all started screaming, I ran back. What Katie said next made me sit down. Did she have 2 braids and a headband? I nodded slowly. Early this morning, like 3 a.m., Jessica woke everyone up and said it was going to rain and that we needed to build a shelter. But there were no clouds last night. I know, but she woke us all up and insisted that we needed to build a shelter and wouldn't drop it till we all moved close together and put up some tarps. I like to see the stars if I wake up, so I just moved closer just in case, but didn't get under the tarp. Neither did Will or Josh. Well, this morning, just before it got light, I had a really disturbing dream where I felt like I was in my sleeping bag and was staring up into the trees above me. And there was this little native girl with 2 braids and a blue-grey headband up in the tree over my face staring at me. I knew I was dreaming, but I couldn't move or wake up. I was only able to move when Josh on the other side of the shelter yelled and sat up. I thought it was just a horrible dream until I spoke to Jess about the rain last night, and she admitted to me that she hadn't been worried about the rain, but had been dead asleep when she felt someone reach into her sleeping bag and shove her head to the side. She panicked and laid there and pretended like she was still sleeping, but they knelt over her face for a few minutes. She was so scared to open her eyes. When she felt them leave, she waited for a few minutes, then woke everyone up. I was wondering why she slept in the middle of everyone, and now it makes sense. I stayed quiet. Before breakfast, I asked Josh why he yelled and sat up, and I was grateful he did, but curious as to why. He told me that he had a horrible nightmare about a little Native American girl, and when he thought he woke up, he saw her running at him. He yelled, and she jumped over his head and took off, and that's when he really woke up and sat up. He was surprised I heard him yell. He thought he had still been asleep at that point, and he dreamed the yelling part. I didn't tell Jess or Josh what happened to me. I didn't tell them about each other either. But at breakfast, Will told all of us about his horrible dream about a little girl dying in the cabin when it burnt down. We all freaked out. It's all we've been talking about today. Half of the group didn't believe us, and Carol Sue, the loud annoying one, has told everyone else we're just trying to haze the new guys. Even Josh, who is a new guy, is in on it apparently. And then the sweat lodge thing happened. With what you told me, I don't think any of us were dreaming. We were quiet for a long time. I think we should move camp down the road, I finally said. I'll clean up this mess in the morning. Katie just nodded and stood up. Oh, Katie, it's probably a good idea for everyone to be under the shelter to sleep tonight, and also maybe don't light another fire. I'm guessing that one of your group's site is out too. She sighed tiredly and walked off into the dark. I just sat there for a while and then slowly made my way back to the truck. I didn't feel like anyone was watching me anymore, but that didn't stop me from sleeping in the cab with the doors locked for the rest of the week. I'm Native American based out of Oregon. Back in around 2006, I went on a youth camping trip with some tribal leaders over the course of spring break. I recall we were all sitting around the campfire, winding down at night after dinner, and I absent-mindedly started whistling. One of the tribal leaders told me to knock it off, and proceeded to tell me why. I learned that there really is a mythology to explain all kind of things, but this one terrified me as a teen. It's the story about why we sleep at night. Natives are spiritual people. The nighttime belongs to the spirits. We give them that time by going to sleep. But the spirits also have these creatures that defend their time. For example, imagine there's a 16-year-old absent-mindedly whistling in the middle of the night, disturbing the one time of day you get to just be you. This would make an angry spirit, and being that you're also a powerful spirit, you could cause chaos, the likes of which the world had never seen. So out of respect for the spirit and fear of what they may do to the world, the creatures are called stick people, and come and take the 16-year-old away so that they're never seen or heard from again. Stick people are, according to the legend I was given, entities that will try to cause people to become lost and alone by luring them to places they have no business being in, like out in the woods at night. And I think about the story every time I whistle. I love to go hiking in the woods with my dog. We were on a familiar trail one day. My dog likes to run ahead and check things out. That's when he suddenly started barking, like a higher-pitched bark. He was scared. So I ran towards him when I was suddenly hit with the overwhelming stench of concentrated urine. My dog was barking at a makeshift tent that someone was living in. It was made of tarps and there was wood smoke coming out of the chimney. It looked like a solid setup. I recalled my dog and took a different path home. The next day I told my co-workers about it because everyone hikes that trail, and no one had seen anything like that. I went back the next day and there was nothing. No sign of any camp, no smell of urine, which would not wash away that fast, as we didn't get any rain. My dog and I have hiked that same route multiple times since, and never seen the tent again. But every time we pass that spot, my dog gets extra protective of me and stays very close, as we both feel uneasy there. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry that the quality of this video perhaps isn't what it should be with my voice not being back to normal yet. I swear I've had this cold for like 3 weeks now and the symptoms are just not going away completely, which is really frustrating. That being said, I've been told by many people that something's going around, so I hope all of you guys are safe and healthy. Alright then, I'm going to wrap things up here and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. A huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you sign up, you get a cool bunch of perks, and if you want to find out more, follow the link to do just that. Until then, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.